Pride always comes before a fall, and no one immortalised the saying more than Sir Thomas Bouch. He was born as the second child of 4, and he grew up firstly in Carlisle, then in Edinburgh. His father was a retired sea captain who gave up his ship for the Ship Inn in Thurso. Thomas's brother William had gone into the railway business as a railway engineer, and his appointment no doubt inspired Thomas to go into the same business. When he was 17, he was appointed as an assistant engineer to the Lancaster and Carlisle Railway to aid in its construction, answering to engineer Joseph Locke and learning from him. The line was long and barren, and didn't have much in the way of towns and villages. However, it proved to be a pivotal link between England and Scotland. It wasn't without controversy, as many thought the line was demanding too much, even from the newest engines, due to its potential steep gradients, and backers shied away from the project due to its sheer size. However, Joseph pressed on, and after a last-minute ministerial change to the route to appease investors, and to get the project finished quicker, the line was finished in 1846. By the time the railway opened, Thomas had already moved on, firstly working in Leeds and then on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Thanks to his earlier success, he was selected to be one of the many resident engineers, helping with various improvements and projects, possibly even helping in part to opening of the Wear Valley Railway. But in the north, plans were brewing that would change his life forever. The Edinburgh and Northern Railway came into existence in 1845 with the purpose to connect Edinburgh to both Perth and Dundee. Considering that the railway to each branch was about 35 miles long, it wasn't nearly as long as the West Coast Main Line, but it had its own unique challenges. 2 of them were estuaries, or firths as the Scottish folk called them. The Firth of Forth and the Firth of Tay both were formidable, and both needed good strong ideas to cross them. While the subject of crossing the firths was on everyone's mind, the rest of the railway was taking shape in stages. Rather than a bridge, the railway considered using ferries to take the cargo across the water. Trains would be unloaded at the harbours, and then the goods would be taken by ferry to a waiting train on the other side. But the ferries were independently operated and were erratic in their approach. They would also charge any fee they wanted. The railway felt that the use of ferries negated the expense of a bridge, and if they bought out the operators and took control, then they themselves could use them. But after spending tens of thousands on the harbours and the steamers, they were as unreliable as ever. Worse still, rival railways started to use land routes and steal their trade. In 1849, Thomas got the call he desperately wanted. He was appointed to manager of the Edinburgh and Northern Railway, and straight away he was tasked with solving the problem. He knew time was of the essence, so he put the ideas of any bridge on the back burner and put forward a radical scheme: the train ferry. Instead of the train being unloaded, the train itself would be shunted by the engine onto the steamer. The steamer's deck would be outfitted with custom tracks, and the harbours would have ramps on either side. These ramps match up perfectly with the ferry's rails. Once docked, an engine would then pull the train off the ferry, ready to continue its journey. As both firths are affected by the tides, the ramps could move up or down, so no matter whether it's high tide or low tide, the rails of the ferries would always line up perfectly. It was called the floating railway, and it was a revelation. It was no way permanent, but it was sufficient enough to keep up with the competition and bring in much needed profit, certainly enough to save for a bridge. By now, Bouch's floating railway had caused a sensation. Bouch decided to go it alone and went freelance, advising railways in both Scotland and Northern England. He dined in the finest circles, saw the best engineers, and helped design various lines. His success was growing, and he was becoming almost a celebrity. But to the builders, there was another part to Bouch that few saw: greed. Bouch was well known to be over-frugal, to the point it was dangerous. If the designer could cut corners, he would. Subpar materials and cheap construction were littered in his tracks. Soon, railway companies were finding that they were paying out hard-earned profits for unneeded maintenance for lines that should have lasted years. And if it was of any quality, it was built with no flamboyance, frills or extras. Still, Thomas pushed on, and he had many successes. Soon he felt it was time to go back to the Edinburgh and Northern Railway. The railway was ready for its bridges, and now had the capital to pay for it. The railway saviour was ready to come home and design the Tay Bridge. During his freelancing, Thomas had developed an interest in lattice girder bridges. Unlike expensive stone, the lattice design was strong, but more importantly, it was cheap. As the plans to replace the ferries over the Tay Firth emerged in 1854, it still took another 16 years to have the bridge reach royal assent. The bridge would be the longest in the world, and for Thomas, this would be his jewel. While the Tay Bridge was being finalised, Thomas worked on another latticed viaduct, the Bella Viaduct. This proved highly successful and lasted for over 100 years. At the time, it was the cheapest viaduct ever built, and spurred Thomas on that this is what was needed for the Tay. But despite the success of the viaduct, the plans for the Tay Bridge were considerably simpler. The bridge would be supported from below using lattice cast iron girders and lattice piers, with the exception of the middle section. Here the track would run through the span. This allowed space for the large tall mast ships and steamers to enter the Firth. Precise machined parts were minimised to reduce costs, but this meant that for some bolt holes on the bridge piers, they weren't perfectly aligned. Instead of fixing the holes or adding the correct bolt, a smaller bolt was used that would fit both misaligned holes. It was easier and cheaper, but when it was under load, it meant that the piers could move, weakening both the joint and the structure. There was also a lack of regard for the bracing as well. While the previous viaducts were strengthened with cast iron girders and secure fixings, the tray wasn't as exact, and if the holes didn't match, metal wedges were driven into the holes. The bedrock holding the piers was also deeper than first thought, and were too deep to act as sufficient foundations for the bridge. So Thomas was forced to redesign the bridge to reduce the number of piers, bypassing the deeper water, and increase the spans of the girders. The builders then dropped brick-lined caissons so the workers could remove sand on the river's floor and build the foundations on what they thought was solid rock. The solid rock, however, was as solid as the sand they removed. It was severely compressed gravel, solid enough to walk on and convince the builders to build on, but definitely not solid enough to hold any extreme weight like a bridge for a period of time. Like the viaduct, the solid rock piers would support the bridge were replaced with steel lattice ones. Once the pier was ready and the foundations laid, the caissons were then filled with concrete, forming the basis of the bridge above the waterline. The bridge was finished and ready to take its first train. But during inspection, the inspectors remarked there was a definite oscillation and movement as the bridge took its first weight. Bridges are designed in some parts to move and flex, and it was decided that this movement was in acceptable parameters, so it was ready and signed off. Bouch was ecstatic, and on the very day the bridge was opened, he was made the Burgess of Dundee. On the 20th of June, he was summoned by the Queen herself, who was about to cross the bridge heading from Balmoral. Just 6 days later, he was further summoned to Windsor, where he was knighted. He had completed the impossible, but the railway was not done. There was one more bridge to build, and it would outshine the Tay, crossing the Firth of Forth. Once again, Thomas's lattice design was approved, and work on the caissons began in earnest. Thomas was now heralded as one of the elite in the engineering world, and he could not be happier. His Christmas Day would have been a merry one, and he could not wait for New Year's. Thomas was on top of the world, and nothing could ever bring him down.